Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Aging Less, the Longevity Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Marie Stella, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of Aging Less, the Longevity Science Insights podcast. I'm Marie, your dedicated host, and today we're exploring something that I tend to struggle with myself, as I'm certain many others do. Sleep. Sleep is often regarded as a quality of life choice rather than a biological necessity, a cornerstone of our health and longevity, just as food or clean water is. But what is the best way to get quality and quantity out of a night's rest? Well, that depends on a number of factors such as exercise, light exposure, and so on. Now, for this episode, we are examining how our environment in particular plays a role in our sleep. And we're fortunate to be joined by organization sleep training expert Daniel White to guide us through this. He's also the founder and chairman of nonprofit organization Sleep Better, Live Better Foundation, and is passionate about teaching busy modern professionals how to supercharge performance, productivity, health, and happiness through deeper rest. So, hi, Daniel. Welcome to the show. How are you going today?
Hey, Marie, thank you so much. You've got me fresh, as they say, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed over in the United Kingdom here. It's quite early in the morning and I'm ready to teach your listeners a little thing or two about sleep.
Yeah, I really appreciate you coming on at such an early time. But are you? Do you usually rise this early?
Yeah, so I have a fairly consistent sleep schedule. It hasn't always been that way throughout my life, not even just my younger life, when perhaps, we do more of that socializing stuff and have more fun at the weekends, something that can usually interrupt our sleep schedules. But also even throughout my career and throughout my adult life, it's not common for people to be able to always keep such a consistent schedule. But I found, increasingly over the years, the more I stick to regular sleep and wake time, I probably head to bed around 9 p.m. I'm probably asleep by about 9:30, 10, and I'm up at around 6 a.m. It tends to bring, a lot of benefits to especially my cognition and how I can function throughout the day.
Yeah, I personally have been sticking to a more consistent sleep schedule more recently as well compared to, my earlier 20s. Uh, and I've already found it to be a lot more, a lot more beneficial for my mental faculties whenever I get up at 7 or 8 and I'm out the door by then, and have a nice walk on the way to work or something like that always fares better for me.
Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense, right? Today we're here to talk about the environment and that key piece of, having some time for yourself before, going into work and having this transitionary period between, a regular wake up time and beginning the day is really important. And one of the things you've already highlighted there is like the environment, getting outdoors, getting that natural light, all things that can set us up for a super productive, focused and grounded day.
Yeah. So before we begin, tell us a little bit about what Sleep Better, Live Better Foundation does.
Oh, thank you. That's such an awesome question to start off with. So I founded the Sleep Better, Live Better Foundation around 5 or 6 years ago. Prior to that, I was working with organizations, and I still do, providing sleep and well-being related training to some of the biggest organizations around the globe. And I became interested in a kind of developed a burning desire to be able to support teenagers and young people because my backstory, my history is that I slept very badly throughout a lot of my youth, and it really affected not only my mental health but also my physical health. I was overweight, anxious, depressed, had a lot of problems learning in school, staying focused, concentrated, engaged. And so about 5 or 6 years ago, I founded the charity to provide zero cost to consumer education tools and support to basically adolescents and their families. And one of the things that we've done in the last couple of years is we ran the first of its kind, I think, in the world, a research project looking at the delivery of sleep and circadian health education and different tools in some very large schools in Guernsey and the Channel Islands, where I'm from. So we're now upscaling that research and education into communities across the globe. One thing I'm sure we'll talk about throughout today's interview at some point is the circadian rhythm disruption, or the CRD challenge that we're now running as we have scaled our charity and are beginning to work with partners all around the world to try and have more of an impact on society at large, but especially this piece around children and adolescents. As you know, it's become glaringly obvious that over the years, this kind of at-risk population, have a lot of opportunities to improve their sleep and their mental health through some of this simple, quite frankly, simple education.
Yeah, it's never too late to start, but also the earlier the better.
Yeah, definitely. And, what we're seeing like a sort of endemic levels of within society at the minute is huge disruption to our circadian rhythms and our biological clocks. And that has, grave impacts on us, whatever point throughout the lifespan, from babies, infancy, childhood, adolescence, old age. Everybody is affected in different ways. And especially as it comes to like growth and development and maturation of like emotional responses and cognition and things like that in childhood. And we've kind of been sleepwalking into these problems, not realizing it. And I'm sure we'll talk about a lot of the, the roots of those problems today. But yeah, I truly believe that, as young as, well, as early as the womb, really, we need to be educating parents, families, and communities about how to make sure that young people are well rested and able to function to their full potential.
Oh yeah, well, thank you for sharing so much of that. It sounds like wonderful work that you're doing, and I am so keen to jump right into the interview and go way further into detail. But before that, I thought it'd be great if we could get to know you a bit better. So, is that all right with you?
Absolutely. Let's get personal.
Perfect. This is Have You Met Daniel? My first question for you is, what do you like to do in your spare time?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I've got lots of different hobbies, and I'll probably highlight some of the ones that you might not think, I suppose, because it might provide an opportunity and possibility for people listening to this to think a little bit outside of the box. So a lot of people often think to me, oh, you must read books every night and be asleep by 8:30 or 9 p.m. And, if you're a sleep guy, you must be so into that. And maybe you're living in a bit of a cardboard box and not able to relate to a lot of the population. But the truth is, I have many hobbies, and some of them throughout my life have kept me awake a little bit later than than I would allow them to these days. So I like DJing. I've been DJing for around 10 years. I really enjoy. Sometimes I really enjoy video gaming with friends. We've got like old, school games that we played from when we were young. Some of the games that actually caused me a lot of sleep problems when I was younger, but I have the knowledge and kind of tools now to deal with those. So I guess I like to put across that, I am a fairly regular human being, entertained by technology, living in the modern world and doing things which aren't always cohesive with the best sleep. But at the same time, I like to mix that kind of like cultural enjoyment with a deep passion and, insights into like how I can support my well-being and function and really work with people at a systems and a societal level to incite change. So I'm a little bit of a Swiss Army knife. There are two sides, the light and the dark to my coin.
Yeah. So with DJing, what kind of music do you like to pick from? And well, I'm not so into the DJing universe, so I have no idea what's going on, to be honest. But I imagine like there's certain types of music that you tend to lean into, and also DJing is quite the nighttime hobby from my understanding. So like where would you when would you do the DJing?
Yeah, it's really, really good question. So I guess no one's ever asked me that before on an interview, and it's very interesting for me to think about because the kinds of music that I'm into, in particular, I like a broad range of music. I think anyone who's a true music fan probably does. but I tend to, be more into what we would call like the underground or like the alternative music scene. And I guess that is, somewhat similar in my career as well, because a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about, discussing, the latest research and the tools and education that I use to support people is usually quite contemporary. It's quite new. It's more like the 1% of people know that sort of stuff rather than the 99%. So in that way, I also like to kind of share that music. So I like a lot of bass culture music, a lot of kind of music that was developed in the 90s, the early 90s, around the time at which I was born, and kind of moving forward from that. So I'm less into the classical stuff and more into the kind of new school electronic bits and pieces. And then as it pertains to like the timing, there were times over the years, even recently, 3, 4, 5 years ago, where DJing for me would mainly be a nighttime or an evening event. And so I would, ask friends if they were putting on events and they were asking me to come down and play. And I'd say, oh, put me on first. I want to be in bed by 11 o'clock. But wasn't always the case, and it did lead to like a lot of late nights and a lot of disruption to my sleep, my circadian rhythms. So these days, I'm not saying that I would never play late night again, but I much prefer to be dancing and playing music during the daytime, which is more of a summer activity. And then in the winter, I tend to hibernate a little bit more.
Yeah, for sure. And do your requests of getting put on first because you want to go to bed by 9 p.m. or something like that, do they ever get taken seriously? How do people view that?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I'm quite fortunate. So one of the main genres that I like to mix is called drum and bass music, and it's very eclectic and it's a very broad genre. And a lot of the music I like is more soulful and it's more kind of tempered. And so usually if I'm playing with like a group of friends, I'll spend more time at the beginning of the night because my music's a little bit softer than maybe some of the more energetic stuff that comes later. So usually the request does get taken seriously, but not necessarily because of my sleep. It's usually because they prefer that I warm the crowd up than I
Yeah.
than I get them totally engaged later on.
Well, then it all fits. Good coincidence then.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and with video games, what sort of video games do you enjoy?
Yeah, so really interesting, and I'll try not to segue too much here. But when I was very young, around the age of 13 or 14, I had some problems going on at school. I was a little bit of bullying, and I wasn't really fitting into this. It was a kind of private scholarship that I got to this international school. And I found solace in what we call MMOs, which are massive multiplayer online games. So, you could walk into a universe, speak to people all over the world. And so I got into that at a very young age. And it caused me a lot of problems in my teenage years, lots of very late nights. I obviously had no idea about sleep and well-being really at that point, which is, interesting because it's very much what I'm trying to teach kids that age now. But it resulted in a lot of circadian disruption. As I said, I gained weight. I was quite anxious, stressed, depressed because I was awake very late into the night and not really engaging in the real world. And funnily enough, I gave up gaming when I was around 17 or 18 years old, and I'm now 31. About 27 or 28, some of my friends came together and we said, should we have a sort of like lighthearted crack at some of those old games that we used to play? And so we still play like the massive multiplayer online games, but it's usually an hour or two after work and not too late before bedtime.
Yeah, I'd say 1 to 2 hours is a good amount of time because anytime that I play games, especially if it's one of those first player ones, which the camera moves with your every movement, I get an insane headache from that. I don't know if I'm the only one. I always get motion sickness from it. But everybody I tell this to just doesn't feel the same way. And yeah, people are really, really into MMOs as well, but I can never just the UI is always so busy because everyone's in the server at once and I'm in this virtual room with a bunch of strangers and it just gives me anxiety. Have you ever felt that way or
Yeah, so it's really interesting, isn't it? Yeah, I think people talk about gaming, and if you've never gamed before, you might not understand the differences. It's like going on Netflix and watching a TV show, right? Like some people choose a documentary about ancient Egypt, other people, choose one of these TV series that is based on real life, right? Two completely different things. And what you're speaking to is kind of like the first person world in the gaming sphere. And I've played some of those games, things like Call of Duty or first person shooter games, and they're super engaging, right? They really, really switch your brain on. there's not much
Yeah.
space for relaxation and winding down in that sort of thing. And then there are, other games such as more strategic games or MMOs or things which are a little bit more kind of, I guess, relaxing in that
Mhm.
sense. And so
Mhm.
I've always been more of like the relaxed social gamer. And it's very
Yeah.
interesting because, although I absolutely would not recommend to any child, in their teenage years to spend as much time on computer and video games as I did, it really helped me to develop like my social compass is what I would say. I developed a lot of skills speaking with and communicating with people like all around the world and making friends and, certainly doesn't translate completely into real life, but I've always been more of a social, chatty kind of guy.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of that. I feel like we got to know you a little bit better. So let's move on to the interview section now and jump right in. Now, for starters, what would you say longevity means to you?
Yeah, so I think that's a very very good question. I used to think of it as, oh, how many years can we stay alive on this planet? And, are we going to break the 100 and become a blue zoner and all this sort of thing? But I prefer to think about it. I take it away from the idea of lifespan now, and I bring it into this idea of like health span, which is how many years can we live, vitally. How many years can we have our cognitive function? Can we be able to act physically and ultimately, carry out our purpose and have enjoyment of the world? I think one of the things that's clearer and clearer in the modern world is that, people may be living longer over the last, 20, 30, 40 years, but a lot of those people are living with a lot of chronic disease. And, they're living with a lot of circumstances that makes life not as enjoyable or, not as vital. So for me, it's really about, how long can we live in a state of health where we can really enjoy, life.
Yeah. And, there are a lot of moving parts to ensuring that state of living vitally for a really long time. So, how would you describe the connection between sleep and longevity?
Yeah, definitely. Well, sleep is such a, rejuvenating and restorative aspect of our biology or our physiology, right? I always say nature never makes mistakes. Okay. So, this idea that, seasonally, when we look into or outside of like the modern world and we look at people who perhaps live in more tribal or rural settings, discussing and exploring how often they sleep, how long they sleep across the seasons. Maybe in the summer it's less, maybe in the winter it's more. And these are all like good signs of, how much like reparation and restoration our body needs. And I think it's becoming increasingly clear, especially in the last few decades, that you can shortchange that sleep, but
Mhm.
ultimately you will shortchange your longevity and your health span because, when we're in these deeper states of sleep, there are so many systems, organs, even down to every single cell of our body that's experiencing that rejuvenation and is essentially keeping like the cells young. And so if we want
Mhm.
to stay awake longer and we want to achieve more, usually it's at the expense of the quality of the way that we live our lives, and, interact with other people. And then, how well we keep our vital signs and our functions going into older age.
Right, yeah. And sleep is known to be beneficial for cellular repair and generation. So, what exactly is the effect that this has on our lifespan, or more specifically, living vitally for a really long time?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I don't know, we can probably dive deeper into this, but there are mechanisms within the body that, as a result of the environment, release certain hormones. One I'm thinking about in particular called melatonin in response to the light environment, not just in the evening, but also in the daytime.
Mhm.
It's not just a brain hormone. For a long
Mhm.
time, we thought of melatonin as the sleep hormone released from the pineal gland at night.
Mhm.
We know that there is intracellular melatonin. There's melatonin produced in all different organs and cells of the body, and it essentially works as a hormone that helps us to like clean up and restore and repair and run these rejuvenation programs in our cells. And so, you know, for us to be able to express the highest degree of melatonin leads us to, keep our cells as young, I suppose, as possible. One of the problems when we shortchange ourselves, not only on quantity, but also on quality of sleep, and we like reduce the expression of that melatonin throughout our body and our brain on a daily basis, is that these systems just age a lot faster. We see people
Mhm.
develop, heart stress. We see people develop like neurodegenerative conditions a lot earlier and earlier these days. And if
Mhm.
we look back and we really trace that on a timeline with how our environment's changed and how that's
Mhm.
impacted, for example, the body's ability to produce this really, really key hormone, which is, not only anti-cancer, it's also anti-aging, it's also
Mhm.
immunoregulatory. And so the more that we've reduced our ability to do that in the modern world, as I said, a lot of it down to our environment,
Mhm.
the quicker rate of decline we're seeing. And so it's like a kind of like a giant experiment in the world at the moment, because things are always changing in society and the environment, especially as it pertains to like technology and light and a lot of these things which have
Mhm.
almost like invaded our personal sleep space over the last 20 years in particular. And we really won't know the impacts of that fully for another 20 or another 30
Mhm.
years until we start to get to the age of our parents, and we can then compare well, what are our levels of physical and mental decline
Mhm.
at what age compared to generations that came before us.
So obviously, environment is really important for our sleep quality and duration. But more specifically, what factors of the environment are important to consider?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think it's important that we kind of like base or embed this conversation in an understanding of like a relatively new phenomenon in medicine called epigenetics. Now, if you kind of decode that word in Latin, epi means above the gene. So we're looking at things outside of the gene itself, which influence our genetic destiny, right? So everything from the food we eat to the way that we move to the stress that we experience, and the things that I think are particularly important to sleep, including like the light environment, the electromagnetic environment, the temperature, and these are all things outside of us. You might call these external, but also, things that are going on internally. So like levels of stress within the body, production of various different hormones such as, melatonin and whatnot. So it's really like a case of how our immediate environment, especially in the evenings, but not only, influences our sleep. I often say to people, though, sleep and the quality of sleep, the quality of rest and recovery is really an amalgamation of things that happen from the moment you open your eyes,
Mhm.
what environment you slept in, where you found yourself when you woke up, and where you placed yourself throughout the morning, the daytime, the afternoon, and the evening. So I think there's only really just beginning to be a truly growing appreciation of how the circumstances of our physical environment actually influence our sleep instead of just our behaviors and our lifestyle choices. A lot of people put a lot of kind of merit in, well, you should decide to go to bed at this time. And, if you choose not to do this behavior, watch this movie or play this video game or, use social media or technology at night, then your sleep would all be fine. And it puts a lot of responsibility on the individual without recognizing that actually, the way that we've created and structured our society, especially, in terms of our light environment, which is an absolutely key piece, really influences this as well.
Yeah, I did notice that. Well, recently I changed all of my light bulbs to smart bulbs so that I can adjust um the the strength of the brightness, I suppose. And it's really helped with my sleep. Like I've been able to sleep with less effort. If that makes sense. And like I get to choose when my wind down time is. So like when I like maybe a couple of hours before bed, I dim the lights and it helps so much more with the act of going to sleep. What can you what would you say is the science behind that?
Yeah, so this is a rabbit hole that we can walk into, and I'm very happy to. Um, Essentially, light governs everything going on in our environment. When we look at it from an evolutionary standpoint, like all of life on Earth exists because of sunlight and photonic energy that comes from the sun. Okay, so it's that energy that grows plants, that feeds human beings. That all of this sort of thing. And the light and the dark cycles, that are produced by the Earth, roughly on a 24-hour kind of axis, but not quite. And they influence like these rhythms that run within our cells. Okay, so every single cell in your body, every single system, every organ has a circadian rhythm or a kind of 24-hour mechanism which governs the activity. So the daytime activity and then the rest and recovery of those organs and systems. And the major, what we call Zeitgeber, which is a German word that translates as time giver, the major giver of time to all of these cells and systems and organs and the clocks that live within them is light and dark cycles. So you have to imagine that for the entirety of human evolution, prior to the invention of electricity, and then, increasingly brighter light bulbs and technology and screens, that's only really I say to people, a grain of sand on the beach of our evolution. It's been about 150 years since we, had the first sources of electric light. And prior to that, it was sunlight, moonlight, and firelight. And that's all that we had exposure to. And so throughout the daytime, there were specific colors or wavelengths of light provided by the sun that had different physiological effects on the body. And one of the points that you noted as well is that the brightness, or what we call the intensity, or in science, we measure it in a term called lux or luminance, and that also varies throughout the day. So you have to imagine that, if I was a caveman, Dan, for example, I give this, little story that 99.999% of the time we've been on planet Earth, we were, cavemen or, hunter-gatherers. And during that time, we would wake up around sunrise as the sun began to get brighter outside, and you would experience or you would bear witness to more of what we call the blue wavelengths of light. So blue light is often, touted as the boogeyman these days. Blue light's so terrible for our sleep, and, it really keeps us awake at night and suppresses melatonin. But in nature, we had a lot of blue light increasing from around the time of sunrise until midday, and then decreasing from around the time of midday until sunset. And then after the sun sets, not only does the blue light wane, or kind of that bright, blue that we see in the upper atmosphere as the sky gets darker, but also the light intensity really decreases. And so prior to any of this artificial lighting, mobile phones, laptops, computer screens, all the things that came after the first simple kind of Edison bulbs, prior to that, we just had these natural cycles of light and dark. And when we reached the evening hours, we could light a fire and we could sit around the warmth of the fire, warm visually, not only warm in terms of temperature, but that didn't have the same impact on our circadian systems. So now, unfortunately, we've kind of sleepwalked into this situation where we've designed lights for efficiency in terms of their illuminance and like what we can see with them. And we've, rushed in the last 50 years to equip the world with as many LED light bulbs as we possibly can for energy efficiency purposes. And, we've banned a lot of the older bulbs, things like the incandescent bulbs, etc., which produced more of a warm light that was a little bit closer to sunlight. And so we've kind of completely, in the blink of an eye, in a generation, changed our light environment. And we're now beginning to realize that, the types, as in the colors, the wavelengths of light, and the brightness of light have such profound impact on every single cell, organ, and system in the body. And now we're kind of like all scrambling to deal with and manage this epidemic of like mental and physical health problems without realizing that the very like undercurrent of our human existence has been very deeply disturbed because of the changes to our environment. And the nice thing about that is that it's, a story which you can probably understand very easily. It makes sense. It's, it's kind of basic stuff. We don't necessarily think about it until someone says it to us for the first time, but it does explain a little bit about how, to begin with, you've been dimming lights in your environment. Oh, and your brain and your body have found it easier to wind down, switch off. No doubt probably produce a lot more melatonin in the evening. So the quality of your rest and recovery is improving. But there are probably some other things you could do as well, like looking, especially if you have these smart bulbs, looking at the actual color of the light that comes out of that bulb in the evening and transitioning from, the brighter, cooler LED, white lights, blue lights, down towards the warmer ambers and the reds that kind of mimic that firelight in the evening.
Yeah, I do love that incandescent glow. I will say that I feel like smart bulbs don't quite recreate or nail that glow, but that's besides the point. The other thing I wanted to ask, now that we've talked a bit about light exposure, was about the design or layout of our living spaces. Does that have an effect at all on our sleep quality?
Yeah, it definitely does, but it's more how those environmental kind of setups influence our relationship to other of these time cues. So one of them is temperature. Now you got to imagine that we lived outdoors. Take Australia for example. You'd be outside in the bush, right? With your tribe. In the mornings, in the evening, in the night, you'd be very cold. You'd be huddling, you'd be outdoors. You'd have this drop in core body temperature. You weren't laying on a mattress. You didn't have all these thick duvets over you, so your body would expel a lot of heat in the evening, which facilitated like a very deep state of sleep, and rest and recovery and rejuvenation. And then every morning the sun would rise, the heat, the temperature in the environment would increase, and that would be very stimulatory to the system. And these days, for example, if we live indoors and we keep windows and doors closed at night, we sleep on these very thick mattresses and very thick duvets. That's one way that the setup of our environment can really derail our ability to get a naturally and evolutionary appropriate depth of sleep. But there are also things as well, like the light, as I mentioned, is huge. The light that we have in our bedroom, our living spaces, but also our proximity to technology can be another one that has a huge impact. Because prior to, living indoors inside these kind of man-made environments, we were physically connected, like touching the earth at all times. For the majority of human evolution, the only types of shoes that we wear or clothes that we wore were made out of natural materials, and they're naturally conductive of the electrical frequencies and energy that comes from touching the physical earth. And so now we've kind of plucked ourselves away from that earth. We live in these multi-story buildings, we're not touching the earth itself. We wear rubber-soled shoes and we live indoors, without that physical connection. But instead, we're surrounded by artificial lights and artificial technology, which gives off its own particular frequency. And so those frequencies can disrupt the communication of our cells. And it can also lead to finding it more difficult to get into those deeper restorative states of sleep. I suppose you have to think about it this way, for anybody listening to this or yourselves, you've been camping before, right? And when you go camping, provided you're not staring into your mobile phone in your tent for hours, you're probably winding down a little bit quicker. You're probably feeling a lot more relaxed and well rested, not as agitated or stressed or as, mentally active as you are when you're around technology, televisions, computers, laptops, iPads, all of these sorts of things. So it's not only that, there are cognitive, alerting kind of properties as a result of using technology and multitasking and doing all these modern things, but also like the frequency or the electromagnetic environment given off by modern technologies versus nature itself is either kind of stimulatory or very relaxing for the system.
Right. So what I'm hearing is that there's validity to that popular phrase that young people use, touching grass, going touch grass essentially.
Yeah, I think it's really strange because I think in the modern day now, people are desperate for solutions, right? Not a lot has necessarily changed about our working environments and our jobs, but in the last 5 to 10 years, more technology, especially post-COVID, using it for entertainment, communication, for everything, right? And it's gotten to the point where we're just absorbing so much content and frequency from all these devices that people are constantly stressed out or constantly agitated. It's become like the new norm. And so there's been this resurgence of reconnection with nature. And in Japan, I think they call it forest bathing. It's been a very well-known thing. You're anxious or you're depressed or you're stressed, and your doctor says, take a weekend off. I'm signing you off work. Go and bathe in a forest. Go and stay at a nature sanctuary or something like that. And that really reconnects us with all those principles of light and frequency and nature. And so there's also this kind of reemergence of a phenomenon known as grounding or earthing. We like to study, these phenomena and give them a name, but our ancestors would have just called it living, right? Being in physical connection with the nature all of the time. And so there's even, technology now, I have a grounding sheet on my bed that plugs into the grounded socket in the wall that brings the energy of the earth, up onto the bed when I sleep at night. So there's this huge explosion in the literature, lots of new books, lots of new publications. And one of the problems with it, though, is, as we strive forward as a society, there's not always a lot of, money or patentable or commercial opportunity in telling people to go and, put their feet on the grass and reconnect with nature,
Yeah.
even though it's so foundational.
Yeah. So, as far as ensuring that our quality of sleep is well maintained, what sort of regulations around technology do you think we should set for ourselves?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I like to think about this as possibility in the future. There were times where we used the example of asbestos, right? We used to use asbestos in buildings. And then after several decades, probably many lawsuits, we found out that material wasn't appropriate and, it made people quite sick. And now we're kind of in a position where we've been like sleepwalking into the, just constant use of electric lighting and technology after hours and all those sorts of things. And so it's not for us to necessarily dictate or police how people use their technology, but embedded within like all of these devices, I believe there should be warnings about, the impacts that certain types of the light can have, as well as, the ability to filter it. So a good example, one of my colleagues, a guy called Dr. Martin Moreed, he was at Harvard University in, I believe, the 70s and the 80s. He was one of the team that located the master clock, what we call the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus of the brain. They produced a paper over the last 2 or 3 years, and he brought together, tons and tons and tons of the world leading scientists who had published something like a combined 3,000 papers in the field of circadian rhythms. And they came up with kind of like determinant status statements that they all voted on. And one of the ones that they voted on was to include warning labels on all of the blue enriched LED lights. So let's imagine any time that you walk into, your local hardware store or your local Apple, Mac, or, Windows store, and you go to buy a computer or you buy a new light bulb or a device, and there's, a little red warning label on the side of the box that says, this is dangerous if you use it at night and it's not filtered or it's not put into, red mode or amber mode, or doesn't have like a setting enabled that reduces what we call like the circadian blue or the types of light that keep us awake. So I think that's very interesting, because these are like policy changes that could be incited at, higher level that would have a phenomenal impact. But as individuals, and myself, I use different technology kind of apps and settings that can filter and change the types of light coming from my screen. And then, it's interesting because we try and suggest that people should have like stricter boundaries around their use of technology, but we don't realize that unless you filter the light coming from them, you don't receive the signals that wind you down and allow you to want to disconnect from it. So if you're looking at a bright screen in the evening, it's keeping your brain awake and it's keeping you engaged and it's keeping you, addicted essentially to using the technology. But if we're able to make some simple changes, so for example, like the light environment, quite often we don't feel that same drive to watch that episode of Netflix or, continue working or scrolling the internet. And in fact, our bodies can naturally kind of wind down and switch off.
Yeah. So, in summary, what would you say are the quintessential bedroom setup things to be aware of to get sorted for better quality sleep?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. And, normally I don't only like to talk about the bedtime, because I do believe it is really like considering the environment from when we wake up until when we go to bed. But obviously those 8 hours or so that we're spending in the bedroom, those are perhaps the most important to protect in terms of like what's going on in the environment. So a couple of kind of non-negotiables for me is I don't take any technology into the bedroom. So if I have my mobile phone in there because I need to use it as an alarm clock or something like that, I'll have it in airplane mode. So it's disconnected. It's not receiving any notifications. There's not any, Wi-Fi or 3G or 4G, these frequencies kind of surrounding the phone necessarily if it's in airplane mode. I also have my bedroom as blacked out as possible. So, some people live close to towns or cities or motorways and have a lot of light pollution coming in the bedroom windows, artificial light. So in those cases, I try to recommend that people black out their bedroom. And then I have like a complete blue light free zone in the evening. So approaching sunset, I'll do something in terms of like the light environment. I'll switch over to red or amber bulbs and turn off any of the brighter overhead lighting. I'll also do the same, and I'll filter my mobile phone and my laptop screen so that they don't produce any blue light. So it turns very red and amber. It's a lot more difficult to see, but your eyes very quickly adjust. And then most nights, unless I'm at home where I don't have any blue light, if I'm out and about, or if I'm still working, seeing friends, I'll use something called blue light blocking glasses. And so that really makes sure that like my light environment and kind of the technology in the environment are really as dumbed down as possible at night, as well as keeping the windows open and really making sure that the bedroom is as cool as possible. So those are kind of like my cornerstones. There are other things as well. You can pay attention to like sound and smell, making things sure that things are quiet, or some people like to use white noise machines. Other people like to light candles or use essential oils and aromatherapy to kind of induce relaxation. But I always say to people, the cornerstones of your circadian rhythms and your circadian health are based on frequency. And so, removing technology and removing the bright artificial light are the two most important things to regulate our kind of nighttime physiology.
Amazing. Yeah, I'd love to go further into detail about what you recommend during outside of the bedroom during the daytime to set ourselves up for success during the night for a successful sleep. But before we do that, let's talk about some emerging trends in sleep technology and future trends ahead of us. What emerging trends in sleep technology are you aware of? Are there any that have a potential impact on sleep quality and longevity and this sort of area?
Yeah, so I would love to talk about that. So, just to recap very briefly, I think the biggest emerging trend I see at the moment is a change in like the light environment. So more people are being aware of like night lights. And, as a kid, I had a night light, right? But it was a very bright LED light. And now people are waking up to the fact that it's actually the type of bulb, the color, like I said, and the brightness. So I think that's a major change. And, having spoken to my friends who run some of the biggest kind of blue light free lighting and blue light blocking glasses companies in the world, those kind of markets are growing exponentially now as people wake up more and more to the science. Another one that I see is looking into like temperature regulation in the bedroom at night. So there's a lot of companies out there now which provide either mattresses or mattress covers or other types of devices that can make the bedding or the mattress itself cooler in the evenings. So there's a lot of research showing now that when we can cool our core body temperature appropriately in the evenings, which would have just happened naturally outdoors, right, when we didn't have so much, like so many duvets and so many opportunities to trap heat. So I use a mattress pad on my bed, which cools me down at night, and that's probably between that and the investments in lighting. Those are like the two most beneficial things and changes that I've made to my environment. And then there's a growing fascination with sleep tech, wearable sleep tech. And there's a lot of cool devices out there now which are working with the nervous system, whether they're like pulsed electromagnetic devices or applications, mindfulness, meditation apps, variety of devices that can help people to wind down and kind of induce that state of relaxation. And I think that for people, who have little experience with traditional things like, breathing exercises or meditation or other ways to kind of activate that rest and digest state of our nervous system in the evenings, that these can be, very good entry level tools to help people relax more because, in the Western world, at least, relaxation isn't usually the highest on our priority list. It's usually achievement, isn't it? So those, and also mixed with, like wearables. So I see a lot of people, unfortunately, I see a lot of people like over relying on sleep wearables these days. We know that they're not the most accurate things in the world when you compare them to the gold standard for measuring and tracking sleep, which is a device we use in laboratories called a polysomnogram. But they can provide people with like useful feedback on, changes they're making and how that might be impacting the quality and the depth of their sleep over the course of, weeks or months. But I also see like challenges that arise in some people around tracking health behaviors, especially sleep. There's a new medical definition that's been added to the literature called orthosomnia, which is where people, almost take the sleep tracking to an obsessive level and, can really affect well-being and, how you think and you feel about yourself and your sleep. So in summary, there's many more as well, areas of emerging, sleep science, supplementation I'm thinking about and all sorts of things like that. But I really support any of them that can bring us back to like a closer evolutionary basis, which is like, cooler in the evenings, darker in the evenings, warmer in terms of the lighting, and then more relaxed in terms of like our nervous system and our internal state.
Yeah. And what would you say are the potential long term health consequences of chronic sleep deprivation? And how can we prevent them?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's something that I've thought about and I've spoken a lot about over the past sort of years. And I think there's this trend within public health sciences to make people aware of the detriments of, not sleeping well or not eating well or not exercising or, not de-stressing. And it's very well intentioned to talk about like all of the problems. And I could list them, right? Heart health, stress levels, blood pressure, cardiovascular problems, memory and learning, mental health problems. There are no mental health diagnoses that, don't come at least connected to some issues and disturbances with sleep. Our metabolism, how our body processes hormones like insulin and ghrelin and leptin that influence our metabolic rate and our body composition. You could look at, detoxification in the brain, the glymphatic system, which helps us to remove all of these plaques and debris and byproducts of, being awake and functioning as a human system. And that ultimately, the less of this detoxification we do, the higher and increased risk of, chronic, especially neurodegenerative stuff in the long term. And you can whittle on and on about it, but it's a very fear-based conversation. And so I usually say to people, we all exist on this spectrum and this continuum of sleep, right? Some of us sleep really poorly. Some of us think we sleep very well. But the good news is that all of us can sleep better, right? And sleep is like we call it the tide that raises all of the ships in the harbor, right? So no matter what it is you want to do, what aspect of your mind, your body, your spirit, if you want to be more innovative and focused and engaged, if you want to be a better communicator, if you want to, lose weight and keep a good body composition or focus on your health and your fitness or, be a better entrepreneur or leader or worker or grandparent or partner or whatever, all of these areas of our life, every ship, if you like, is raised by that tide of sleep. So I try to say to people, let's get excited about the reasons that, paying more attention to our sleep can bring more to our lives. Not just, the detriments and the downsides. Obviously, some people need to hear that, ultimately, it's very likely that you can extend your life by years if you begin to focus and pay attention to like the emerging sleep science now.
Yeah. Well, that's actually something else that I wanted to ask, which is, there are some people that do have quality sleep and sufficient sleep as well without doing all of these things or without paying attention to any of these things. So, what benefit is there for them? Would it benefit them at all to um, still pay attention to these things? Or, yeah, does it make a difference?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, one of my favorite quotes, and it's touted as like one of the most dangerous quotes in the English language is, we've always done it this way. So I had lots of clients who have said to me, I've always got 6 hours sleep. I've been running my business for 20 years, or I sleep well every night. Nothing wakes me up. There's nothing you can teach me about sleep. I don't need your help. I sleep fine. But people don't understand that sleep is as much about quality as it is about quantity. And when we do the thing better, we do everything in life better. And so whatever it is, that you're doing, whether you're teaching, you're speaking, you're, running a business, you're a parent, you're a younger person learning in academic settings, all of those things improve when we improve the quality of our sleep. And usually it doesn't take a lot, right? And I say to people, it's kind of a little bit like, marginal gains in those cases.
Mhm.
Like physiologically, even if you sleep well at night, higher production of melatonin is only going to lead to like more rest and recovery over the long term for your longevity. But then it's also really important, I think, to consider the fact that like just because you sleep well, doesn't mean that you're sleeping as well as you could, I suppose. And
Yeah.
people become very accustomed to it. It's very relative, right? People judge their lives relatively. So if I slept really badly for a week now, and then I slept, continue to sleep that way for a month, by the end of the month, I'd probably adjust to that being my new normal.
Mhm.
And just because nothing like, tragic has happened or there haven't been a huge change in my sleep, I kind of adjust to that being the way that it is. And so I try to incite people to think about possibilities when it comes to their sleep and recovery. And it's like,
Yeah.
if you have things that you're passionate about, making sure that you're better rested is only going to improve all of those things.
Yeah, that is so true. The point you bring up about relativity, because what is the metric for quality, like sleep quality? Because some people might view pure, just uninterrupted 6 hours of sleep as quality sleep. But yeah, what is the standard for sleep quality? I actually don't know this.
Yeah, so it's a really good question, right? And researchers have looked at it in so many different ways. Um, in academic settings, you would say the standard, is defined by sleep measurements, which are taken
Mhm,
on polysomnography machines, which demonstrate the amount of time and the cadence between the different stages of sleep. The lighter
mhm,
stages, the deeper stages, the rapid eye movement, all of which have different physiological impacts on the body
mhm,
and our ability to transition through cycles. So each night we
mhm,
go cyclically through these different stages of sleep, ideally around 5 or 6 times a night. And each one of the cycles lasts about 90 minutes. So,
mhm.
previously we said, 8 hours, 8 hours is the golden rule. But really it paid no respect to like physiologically these transitions that we experience through these different sleep cycles. And so a lot of places have backtracked and kind of redefined it as, somewhere between 6 and 9 hours or 7.5 and 9 hours, getting good quality depth of sleep. I say to people, really, it's like, how do you feel when you wake up in the morning? If you wake
Mhm,
up and you feel like, okay, we're ready to go. Like I've slept well, I'm, energized. I'm ready to tackle the day. Of course, we're not going to be our most vibrant and alert the second we open our eyes. But if we're snoozing the alarm clock, if we're feeling exhausted when we get up in the morning, like if we feel like we could sleep for a lot longer, or we're really it's taking us a lot of caffeine to get going, or a lot of stimulants in the morning, that kind of suggests to me that we haven't gotten quite the quality of recovery that we could. So what I try to again appeal to everybody is that an understanding that you've set your norm, right? And that might be set by the social norms of like your family, your friends, your colleagues, or whatever. But that you can experiment, right? That a lot of these changes that come with improving sleep, and they help you to understand that there is like perhaps a new norm out there. But I try to say to people, how well you feel engaged throughout the day, how you're able to like focus and stay attentive and things like that. These are all side effects of the quality of our sleep, right? There's a reason that in populations of people with, for example, like ADHD or, other neurodiverse conditions who sleep poorly, they really struggle to stay focused and attentive and engaged. And I know about that because, I experienced a lot of ADHD-like symptoms in my younger years. So it's really different for everybody, but I think that ultimately, we should be able to remain relatively energized throughout the daytime. We shouldn't be having huge peaks and troughs in our energy levels. A lot of that can be dietary as well as sleep. But if we're getting good enough quality sleep, we shouldn't be requiring a lot of stimulants in the morning. We should naturally be becoming more alert fairly soon after we wake up.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of your expertise with us. I really, really appreciate it. Now let's move on to the practices and habits section. We'll talk a bit about the daily application of what you've shared. So, wanted to circle back to things that we can do outside of the bedroom. What are some practices or habits that you recommend doing in order to maintain quality sleep?
Yeah, so this is a really good question, and I talk about different things, and I probably embed this in the context of like what we're doing in our charity at the moment through this CRD or circadian rhythm disruption challenge. And I say to people that until you pay attention to the key signals in the environment that influence your body clock, you don't really stand a fighting chance of getting the best quality sleep possible. So a lot of what I talk about in the daytime is engaging with these time cues or these zeitgeibers in the environment in order to properly entrain and set the timing of the clocks inside of all of our cells that dictate not only when we go to sleep and wind down, but also when we feel alert and focused and engaged and energized. And really, it begins in the morning. So we have to appreciate that, evolutionarily, we would have been outside. The moment we opened our eyes, we were already outside in the natural environment, seeing natural light, not through a window, not through a car window or a window in the house or anything like that. And so getting outdoors and getting natural light throughout the daytime, probably one of the most important things that we can do to begin all of these biological programs in the clocks and to set and entrain our rhythms. And then in the evening is really paying attention to, the change and the shift in the environment, making things cooler, making things darker, switching to the blue light free lighting and using different settings on mobile phones, laptops, technology to change the lighting, maybe opting for a pair of blue light glasses. And these are the most major determinants because I say to people, unless you respect that natural light and dark cycle, and you really embed yourself in the bright daylight, and then you darken the sleep environment, then your circadian systems or your 24-hour clocks are already at a disadvantage. So that's a lot of what we're teaching people, is at a baseline, to reconnect with what our bodies and our cells and our systems expect from our environment naturally.
So, in your experience with all the work that you do, what are some of the main challenges that people face when trying to pay a bit more attention to the environment to get a better night's rest?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, we're creatures of habit. And I think that post-COVID, the boundaries and the lines have really been blurred between work and home and how we entertain ourselves. So a lot of the time in the evenings is spent gravitating towards technology, whether it's taking some time off to sort of procrastinate after a long working day on social media, or, watching a bit of Netflix, or, using technology to entertain ourselves, maybe play some video games, or do whatever we do as human beings. And what I often see is that people, they kind of avoid that being a problem. And it's a whole conversation in itself as to whether, we should set boundaries around our use of technology and gravitate towards more, like reading a book or playing a board game, or, spending some time offline in those hours before bed. But I try to say to people that a first step can just be like changing the light environment. So, I alluded to you at the start of today's interview that, I still play some video games sometimes with my friends. I still do a bit of DJing, in the evening sometimes, especially when I'm at home, sort of to relax and switch off from work. But I'm really attentive to the light environment. And so, if people aren't willing to consider the light environment, that's a huge barrier. And what I like to say to people is, it doesn't mean that you can't use your mobile phone. A lot of sleep scientists and sleep doctors will tell you, you must come off your mobile phone 2 hours before bed. And the reality is, it's just not reality for the majority of people. We're addicted to devices, apps and settings, and even Netflix is designed in a way in which it keeps the episodes rolling into the next episode. It's all about engagement. I think their key metric is how long can they keep you on an app for. And so these technology programs and devices, they're designed in ways that stimulate, dopamine and other neurochemicals in the brain so that we continue seeking use of them. But one of the biggest factors, like I said, that also influences like dopamine, cortisol, and our drive to use technology is the light in the environment. So a lot of what we teach, especially around young people and entrepreneurs, business leaders, people in the corporate world who have to work late, maybe have to answer emails, or, they feel driven to achieve more. I understand, because I'm a very type A person myself, but it's really like take a very hard look at what you can do to the light environment. Download screen filters. There's a program that I use called Flux, Flux, or another one that's called Iris, and you can like change the light that comes from your screens in the evening. So if you want to stay on, and answer a few emails or watch a little bit of television, you might filter it. Again, it's not going to be like blockbuster quality cinematography if you're taking, some of the types of light out of the screen, but you can still, wind down, relax, and get better quality sleep whilst initially transitioning towards, finding other things to do in the evening, or, still managing to get the modern world and our responsibility, our entertainment, our enjoyment out of this tech without it completely sabotaging our sleep.
Yeah, that's really well said. So thank you so much for sharing that. I believe we've covered everything that I am hoping to cover today. So let's move on to the open mic section. And this is your chance to talk about anything that you're passionate about, and doesn't have to be related to the topic. So the floor is yours. Take it away, Daniel.
Thank you so much. So the number one thing that I'm passionate about is providing education to society at large, but really to like families, institutions, organizations that can disseminate that information down into the youth. I believe that in the world, we face some very, grave problems with our environment, our natural environment, societies, technology, AI. There are a lot of challenges that human beings face. And there's a lot of, really well-intentioned, super intelligent and passionate people who are trying to solve those challenges. And if we don't do it in our lifetime, it will be our children, it will be our grandchildren that, work towards solving these problems. But they cannot do that if they're all tired, anxious, stressed, depressed, and underperforming because they're essentially sleep deprived, and their, growth and their maturity and like their learning and, even socializing have been impacted so much by, the stress that's brought by this kind of modern lighting environment and an inability to sleep well. So I've always been looking at the world and society from a sort of 10,000 foot view of, what like small pieces can we change on the chessboard that will have a huge outcome on, the future of humanity. And so when we registered our not-for-profit Sleep Better, Live Better Foundation, and then more recently, the Quantum Leap Foundation, which is our global organization, we wanted to really think about how we could make a mark, how we shift the tide on the future of humanity through maybe some simple education. We've got lots of challenges with our health and well-being, the way that we overwork, the way that we eat a lot of, trashy and processed food. And a lot of these are big system, changes that I don't even know if they're possible. We've come so far forward in some of these industries and stuff to really reverse the impacts. A lot of this kind of modernity, I like to call it, is, potentially tens, if not hundreds of years from, realization. But when it comes to educating people about their circadian rhythms, so these biological clocks and simple changes, things that we can do in the environment, like around technology use and around lighting, I believe that, it has phenomenal potential to improve people's energy, their motivation, their drive, as well as their, creativity, problem solving, and just how they feel about themselves and their communities. So we are launching the Circadian Rhythm Disruption, or the CRD Challenge. Now, if you remember, about 10 years ago, they launched something called the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge. Do you remember that one?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, so it was really interesting, right? It was like a worldwide awareness and education fundraising program, and it raised about 150 million for ALS research. Okay, and that's obviously a super awesome thing. But when we look at ALS, it doesn't take away from how brutal it is for anybody that suffers with the condition, but it's about 0.009% of the population that suffer from ALS, right? And 100% of our modern, westernized populations are susceptible to the impacts of circadian rhythm disruption. And it's, impacting everything from short-term symptoms, energy, focus, relationships at home, all the way to like very serious things like growth and development in children, mental health related concerns, chronic disease in every form, autoimmune disease, cancer, like the links between disruption to these rhythms and almost every, non-communicable disease is very profound and established within the literature and the research. And so we wanted to run a challenge that could create a global shift in consciousness around these topics. And, it's one thing to sit on a podcast and talk about, get some red lights in your house and use these light filters and this, that, and the other. But we're far more complex than just, commands and and instructions. As human beings, our behavior, really is embedded within social norms. It takes for us to, be quite often surrounded by people who are doing the same things as us, encouraging us. And so that we adopt that into like our zeitgeist as something that's normal. And so that, we're not fighting against the current as per se, like, we're riding the waves with everyone else that's making change. And so we're launching the CRD Challenge. It goes live on the 20th of October, 2024. I'm not quite sure when this episode will go on the air, but it's an opportunity for it's an opportunity for anybody around the globe to come and take part in a 21-day free learning journey and experience where they'd be surrounded by, thousands and thousands of other people who are making small, consistent changes to, their environment and to their behaviors over a number of weeks to really feel the potential of a life lived in rhythm with nature. And, we want everybody, wherever they are, I suppose, on the spectrum of health and disease, through from, end of life care to, chronic disease, maybe for decades, to, health related problems, to high functioning, to be able to experience, the vibrancy and the health that's brought by having, well regulated circadian rhythms and well established sleep patterns. So we're kind of putting that thing out into the universe. We launched a couple of days ago, and we've had hundreds and hundreds of people register already. So if people are interested in kind of, gently being guided and embracing, change, and like learning about the latest, most contemporary and novel science, the sort of stuff that hasn't yet made it into your primary physician's office, that maybe the tabloids and public health won't even be catching wind of for another 5 or 10 years. There is a mass movement beginning around this stuff, and we're kind of spearheading it from the point of view of, providing free education, but also, fundraising for efforts to really infiltrate, institutions and educational kind of leaders so that future generations can learn about this stuff, from a very, very young age. There's a Buckminster Fuller quote, which is, if you want to change the current paradigm, you don't infiltrate it. I'm butchering this a little bit, paraphrasing it, but, you don't change the current paradigm, you create a new one. And so what we're trying to do is, provide a new paradigm or a new way of being, and really inspiring people to, especially spread that information amongst the youth so that in 10 or 20 or 30 years time, we haven't sleepwalked further into an epidemic of chronic disease, but we've actually, embedded principles and foundational kind of ways of being for future generations that can help us to unravel a lot of the burden that our societies face in terms of healthcare, but also to inspire people to, really, realize what is possible and to unlock their, greatest human potential.
Well, that's a fantastic cause. Thank you so much, Daniel, for sharing all of that with us. Now, if our listeners want to find out more about you and what you do, about the CRD challenge, about Sleep Better, Live Better Foundation, where can they go?
Yes, so two websites. Probably the easiest place to find us is the CRD, so C as in Charlie Romeo Delta, crdchallenge.com, and then also sleepbetterlivebetter.co.uk. So those are the two websites. If people are interested in finding me, I'm on LinkedIn, Daniel White. I'm on Instagram as Daniel White Health. You also find me on Facebook under Daniel White Health as well. So, come and engage, come and learn more about what we're teaching the world. Or if, you just want to take baby steps, bring yourself, bring your friends, your kids, your family, your colleagues, come and join the CRD challenge.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. I actually just have one more question before we end. I noticed that you have red lights behind you, and you were talking a bit about red lighting before. But I use like dim amber lights, like from smart bulbs. What difference does that make?
Yeah, so that makes a phenomenal difference. Now, when we look at like the visible spectrum of light, okay, so it goes from like the purples into the blues, the greens, the yellows, the ambers, the reds. It's like the color of the rainbow, right?
Yeah.
When we look at the sun, it has a spectral distribution or a combination of all of those different colors, which is why it comes out as kind of like a white light. But in the morning and in the evening, if you're to watch a sunrise or a sunset, it's very like warm, what we call it, like reddish and amberish. Okay, then after the sun sets and it's dark at night, firelight again is very, very warm. And so what you're doing by using the amber light is you're creating a more kind of fireside scene in your home in the evenings, dimming the lights down, making more amber, more red. It removes the blue wavelengths. So it actually allows your brain to produce more melatonin in the evening. So I always say to people, amber is a really great color to use sort of in the hours immediately following sunset, especially if the sun is setting earlier. Now, I don't know about where the listeners are, but in the UK now we're transitioning into the autumn or the fall season, so it starts to get a lot darker a lot earlier. So I'll use amber lights in the early part of the evening, and then just before bed, maybe an hour or two before bed, I'll transition over to red. And so the red light is an even kind of warmer, deeper color, which influences, or I should say, which doesn't stop the production of melatonin. So those warmer, deeper, redder, and kind of lower illuminance or dimmer lights in the evening are the perfect thing to make sure that your body's circadian rhythms stay in check as nature intended.
Well, that's interesting. I just might start doing that. So thank you for sharing that, and thank you everyone for tuning in. I'll link everything in the show notes, so you can check out the CID challenge and Daniel and all of his work. And yeah, we'll catch you in the next episode.
Thank you so much, Marie.
You have been listening to Aging Less, the Longevity Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website at longevity.lifemanagementsciencelabs.com, where you can join our movement. I'm Marie Stella. Thanks for tuning in.